Hello, this is my 30-minute talk about antibody testing for COVID-19. A little bit of background. I'm a UK-trained general practitioner. I've been practicing as a medical doctor in Tokyo since 2008, and I work out of an office in central Tokyo. We're located just in front of Tokyo Tower, the Tokyo Medical and Surgical Clinic. And my colleagues and I have been treating patients from the foreign community since 1951. So specifically for the COVID-19 outbreak, we are providing information and support for both individuals and also for organizations in Tokyo. And really our focus is on helping the foreign community to manage the outbreak. As part of that, we're presenting a weekly webinar on COVID-19 and looking at specifically at its impact on the foreign community in Japan. And we're holding that on Thursday evenings at 6 p.m. and this is the schedule. I'll put this up again at the end so you can check it one more time. This is an overview of the talk today. I'm going to look briefly at the different kinds of COVID-19 tests, PCR and antibody tests. I'm going to go into a bit more detail about how we measure the accuracy of medical tests, because that's really the key of this talk, is for you to understand how you can determine if a test is going to give you useful information or not. And at the end of this, I'd like you to be able to decide if you want to have an antibody test, and also to consider that if you do have one, are you able to rely fully on the result that it generates? Okay, so first of all, let's look at the different kinds of COVID-19 tests. So as I said before, two types of tests, PCR test and antibody test. I think we've heard these terms quite a lot in the news. So let's just look a little bit more at exactly what they are and what these terms mean. So PCR stands for polymerase chain reaction. So this is a chemical process that detects a specific section of genetic code, so a specific piece of DNA or RNA. The technology's been around for a long time. It was invented in California in 1983, and it can be used to detect a specific piece of genetic information that's unique to an individual or an individual animal. So a piece of DNA that only I have, or only one particular individual has. That's used in forensics, so it can be used to link someone to a crime scene, or it can be used to study family genetics as well. In medicine, we're more interested in PCR because we can find a unique piece of DNA that's specific to a particular organism. So if a particular virus or bacteria has a section of genetic code that isn't found anywhere else, by looking for that bit of genetic code, we can see if that virus or bacteria is present or not. So that's PCR testing. What about antibodies? So we've known about antibodies for even longer. We've known about them for over 100 years. We know that antibodies are made after new infections. So if someone's infected with any kind of virus, bacteria, other pathogen, a few days or maybe a few weeks after the infection starts, the body will react. And part of the reaction is to make antibodies. So the purpose of the antibodies is to help us fight the infection. And every time we get infected, we make a new, different kind of antibody specific to that infection. After you've been infected with something, your body will continue to make antibodies for years and years. So antibodies are our kind of immune memory. And I guess the best example of that is perhaps childhood illnesses, things like measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox. So these are infections that we get once as a child, we make antibodies, and then those antibodies protect us against that infection for the rest of our life. Okay, so what are the scope of using these tests? First of all, starting with PCR. So PCR will detect an infection pretty well immediately after you've become infected. A lot of infections have a latent period, a period during which we have no symptoms, but during that period we still have virus or bacteria replicating inside us. So PCR can detect infection, right from day one. But equally, as soon as we've cleared an infection, so for example, 2 weeks after I got sick, I've completely resolved an infection, the virus is gone from my body, there's no longer anything to detect, so the PCR test will become negative. So we can use PCR tests to confirm that someone is free from infection, as well as to pick up the onset of a new infection. Okay, what about antibody tests? So antibody tests don't work immediately. That's a key difference. So whereas PCR becomes positive potentially on day one of an infection, it usually takes a few days, up to even a few weeks, before we start to make an antibody. So during those first few days, an antibody test is no good. There's nothing for it to detect. Having said that, antibody tests stay positive for a long time. So we'll continue to make antibodies potentially for years after an infection, and an antibody test can be used to look to see if we've had an infection in the past, even if we've cleared it from our body. Having said that, the duration for which we might make antibodies against COVID-19 is currently unknown because it just hasn't been around for long enough. Okay, so let's look at these two kinds of tests, PCR and antibody tests, and let's think a bit about how reliable they are. So I guess the first thing to say is that pretty well no medical test is 100% reliable. If we're doing any kind of medical test, we need to know, first of all, if it generates a positive result, how reliable is that result? Or could it be a false positive? And equally, if we get a negative test result, we need to know how much confidence we can have in that. So is it a true negative or a false negative? Let's think about these two tests again, PCR and antibody test. So if I do a PCR test and it's positive, how reliable is that? And before we look at that, let's first of all just look at how we do the tests. So PCR is taken from a nasal swab. Antibodies are tested for in the blood. So if you had a nose swab for COVID, then it was a PCR test. And if someone took a blood sample, then they're going to do an antibody test. So what about a positive PCR test? That's considered to be extremely, extremely reliable. So we found a piece of genetic material that only exists inside the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which causes COVID-19. Now, that genetic material can't really exist anywhere else. So the only time we could conceivably get a false positive test is if the swab that was taken was somehow contaminated with material from another swab. So, that really comes down to how well a lab is run. Within a lab, if genetic material is allowed to contaminate samples, then that could generate false positive tests. But by and large, in medicine, we consider PCR to be as accurate as we can get. We kind of regard it as the gold standard test. Okay, so the other situation, if we do a PCR test and it's negative, how certain can we be that that person doesn't have COVID-19? And this is a little bit more cloudy, unfortunately, because this really depends on how accurately the swab was taken. So to do a swab, we put the cotton bud all the way to the back of someone's nose. It's kind of going halfway into your head, and we keep it there for 10 seconds, kind of turning it round. It's quite an uncomfortable test to do, and that's to give us the best possible chance of picking up the virus from inside the nose. So if you did the test too quickly, if you only swabbed the front of the nose, if you swab the throat instead of the nose, it's possible that you might not collect the genetic material you're looking for, and you might get a false negative result. Okay, so that's PCR. Now moving on to antibody tests. How reliable are those? Positive antibody tests. Positive antibody tests are probably not as accurate as positive PCR tests. With antibody tests in general, if you're doing a test for a particular kind of infection, if there's another infection which is very similar, then you may get some cross-reactivity between the antibodies that are generated. So infection with something that looks very similar might cause antibodies to be produced that would give a false positive test result. So we don't know yet, but it's theoretically possible that if you'd been infected with a different coronavirus, not the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and then you had an antibody test, you might get a false positive result. But there's still research ongoing into that. Okay, what about a negative antibody test? Well, I mean, as I mentioned before, your body doesn't make antibodies as soon as you're infected. It takes a few days to a few weeks. So if you test someone very early on, if you test someone a few days after they've been infected with SARS-CoV-2, or in fact with a number of other infections, you may well get a false negative antibody test. So that's why if we use antibody testing, for example, to detect HIV, we often ask people to come back and do a second test after a 4-week interval to allow their body to potentially make antibodies to an infection if we suspect it might be there. Okay, so having said that, all of these tests generate false positive and false negative results, and that nothing's 100%. What's the measure of reliability that we use to decide how good a medical test is? Well, let's think of a situation where we're testing a group of people. Some of them have got COVID-19, some of them have been infected with SARS-CoV-2, and some of them have not been infected. Some of them don't have COVID-19. And we've got a test, whether it's PCR, antibodies, or any kind of test. Well, if we test people, some of them will test positive, some of them will test negative. There are 4 possible situations here. So what we want is that the people who do have SARS-CoV-2, who have been infected and have developed COVID-19, they all test positive. So that's the true positive tests. And we want the people who don't have the infection to test negative, because that's a true negative test. But given that the tests we're using are never 100%, we are going to get a certain number of positive tests in people who are not infected. Those are false positives. And we're also going to get a certain number of negative tests in people who are infected. That's false negatives. And there's a sort of mathematical way of assigning value to these tests. So we like to talk about sensitivity. So sensitivity is looking at how accurate positive test results are. And we calculate sensitivity by looking at the total number of true positive tests divided by the total number of people who actually do have an infection. Okay? And we also like to calculate specificity. So specificity is looking at how accurate negative tests are. And that's calculated as the number of true negative tests over the total number of people who don't have the condition. Okay, so I think it's probably easier to grasp that if we just work through an example. So let's say we've got 1,000 people, and within that population of 1,000 people, 100 of them have got hepatitis B and 900 of them don't have hepatitis B. And we've done a gold standard test to establish this beyond any reasonable doubt. Now, there we go. There's the 100 people who do and the 900 people who don't have hepatitis B. Let's say I've got a new test and I want to know if it's any good or not. So I run that test on those 1,000 people, and I don't know who's sick and who isn't. I'm using the new test to try to figure this out. And I get 120 positive and 880 negative test results. Then we use our gold standard perfect test to figure out what's actually going on, and we look at how well we really did. So of the 100 people who genuinely did have hepatitis B, my new test correctly identified 96 of them. And out of the 900 people who don't have hepatitis B, my new test got it right in 876 of them. So we got it wrong a few times. We got 24 test results, people who tested positive even though they didn't have hepatitis B. And then here we go on the other side, the false negatives. Of the 100 people who did have hepatitis B, 4 of them tested negative. So sensitivity, that's the number of people who test positive over the total number of people with a condition, so 96 over 100. Sensitivity of this test is 96%. And specificity, that's the 876 people who don't have the condition, who tested negative over the 900 who don't have the condition. And that works out to a little bit over 97%. So that is not really good enough for modern medical practice. There are too many false negative and too many false positive tests. If we were looking to commercialize a test for hepatitis B, we would want sensitivities and specificities of over 99%, I think. What's the situation with COVID-19 antibody tests? Where are these coming from? So a lot of people are making COVID antibody tests. There's a lot of interest. And this has kind of been fast-tracked as a process. So, for example, in the US and in other countries, there's normally quite a laborious and time-consuming process to approve a new medical test. Now, that was deemed to be too clunky and too slow for the COVID outbreak. So the FDA is issuing what's called emergency use authorizations, and the same process is happening in other countries too. Basically, this allows companies to kind of cut through the regulatory process and start using their tests with much less testing and validation than would normally be required. And with these emergency use authorizations, a lot of companies are doing exactly that. This is just in 5 weeks, from the 1st of April to the 4th of May. A whole bunch of companies, 12 companies, released COVID-19 antibody tests. So, are they any good? Let's have a look. Some of these tests are made by small companies that we really know very little about. They don't have much of a track record. They haven't necessarily made a lot of these kind of tests before, and perhaps they don't really have a reputation that they need to protect. A lot of these tests have only been tried out on very small numbers of people. So at my office, we were offered an antibody test that had been trialed on 500 people. And that's really not enough to give you valid statistical answers as to how sensitive and how specific the test is. And of course, as I mentioned before, these tests are not going through the formal regulatory approval process. It's just too time consuming and too slow to be appropriate in an epidemic. Okay, and when you actually are offered these, as a medical doctor who gets offered these tests, people tell me that they're 95% accurate without really going into detail as to whether that means that they're 95% sensitive or specific or both. And often you're not actually shown the original data on which that 95% accurate is drawn from. Okay, so does it really matter? Is 95% or 90% or whatever good enough? Well, let's have a little think about that. Let's have a look. So, first of all, these antibody tests are being used to make some fairly big decisions about where we are with respect to the COVID-19 outbreak. And I think the one that sort of hit the headlines the most recently was the news that antibody testing estimated that almost 14% of people in New York had coronavirus. And that kind of study is being duplicated, perhaps on a smaller scale, in other countries. A study's been reported really quite widely in the Japanese media, where a group of doctors did an antibody test in a hospital, in a clinic, in an outpatient setting in Kobe. So let's have a little bit more of a look at this Kobe study. The Kobe study hasn't actually been published yet, but it's gone online as a kind of pre-publication teaser. So what the doctors who put the study together did was they collected samples from 100 patients who attended a clinic between the 31st of March and the 7th of April. Now, these were not people who were sick with respiratory infections. These were people going to clinics for routine blood work, maybe to get their cholesterol checked or something like that. So this was taken as being 1,000 people representative of the general population of Kobe. Of those 1,000 samples, 33 of them were antibody positive for SARS-CoV-2, antibody positive for COVID-19. And the conclusion of the guys who conducted the study is that if you extrapolate this to the whole population of Kobe, which is about 1.2 million people, over 50,000 people are antibody positive, i.e. have been infected with SARS-CoV-2. And that sounds like a lot, given that in the whole of Japan, there have only been less than 20,000 infections total. So that really sounds like a very big number. And then if you go back through the government data, the actual number of people diagnosed by PCR, by the gold standard test, on the 7th of April, the cumulative number of cases for the whole of Hyogo Prefecture, which is Kobe and the rest of the prefecture it's found within, was 216 cases and 12 deaths. So, and that's out of a population of over 5 million. Kobe is only 1.2 million. So there's a very, very large discrepancy between the number of positive antibody tests and the number of people who've actually been diagnosed. Antibodies testing suggests that 50,000 people have been infected, and PCR testing has identified 216. Now, I'm not saying for a moment that there are only 216 people who've had COVID-19. I'm sure there are people who've had minimal symptoms, who've been unable to access testing, who've had COVID-19 and haven't been picked up on the PCR test. I'm not sure if there are over 49,000 of them, because we know that COVID kills between 1% and 3% of people it infects. So had 50,000 people been infected, we would expect definitely over 1,000 deaths. So what's going on here? I mean, is something weird happening in Hyogo, in Kobe? Are tens of thousands of people getting sick but not getting diagnosed? Are thousands of people getting COVID with almost no deaths? Or is the test that's been used for this study unreliable? And would a small degree of unreliability account for this very, very large number of positive tests? Well, I think that's a very important point to consider, because, I mean, we're using these tests to make big public health decisions. We need to know where we are on this epidemic curve. So, I mean, as we've seen in the media a number of times, pandemics proceed in a curve like this. It's described as the sombrero. So at the beginning, no one's infected, and because of that, the disease spreads very quickly. As more and more people get infected and hopefully become immune, the disease has fewer people to potentially infect, so it slows down. And we think that, variably from different infections, by the time that 60% of the population are immune, the disease will spread much, much more slowly and the epidemic will really be over. So we use antibody tests to tell ourselves where we are on that curve. Are we in the middle? Are we at the beginning? Or are we close to the end? And we also use antibody tests to help us figure out how many people get COVID-19 and have no symptoms, because we're aware that a small number of people at least, although we don't know exactly how many, do get COVID-19 and don't get sick. What about at an individual level? What about making individual health decisions, which is the main reason people want to have an antibody test if they talk to me? So let's say someone comes in and tells me they were very sick in February, they're pretty sure they had COVID-19, but they couldn't get a test. Now they're all better for a variety of reasons. They want to know if they've got a degree of immunity. I mean, even if it's no guarantee that they're fully protected, they would like to know. And as a healthcare provider, I mean, that goes double for a healthcare provider. If you're working with sick people on a regular basis, if you have immunity, you can do so perhaps with a lower degree of concern. So I think healthcare providers particularly would like to know if they have antibodies, if they have at least some degree of immunity to COVID-19. Okay, so let's go back. So we said, well, these tests are maybe 90-95% accurate. Does that mean that the results are so unreliable? Isn't that good enough for day-to-day use? Let's work through that one. So here are my 1,000 friends. So here's 1,000 people, and none of them have had COVID-19. They're all healthy. Fantastic. Okay, let's take the same 1,000 people, and this time 50 of them, so 50 out of 1,000, have had COVID-19, but we don't know which ones. So we're going to use antibody testing to try to figure it out. So someone's come to me with a new antibody test. It got emergency use authorization. It's on the market. It hasn't really been tested that much. but we think it's about 90% sensitive. So 9 times out of 10, it'll give you the right answer and pick up people who've been infected. And it's even better for specificity. It's 95% specific. So 95% of the time, if testing people who haven't had COVID, it'll give us the right answer. That doesn't sound too bad, no? So let's run some numbers on that. First of all, let's test the 1,000 people who didn't have COVID. So 1,000 people who didn't have it and no one who did. Let's use that test that I just mentioned. Well, the specificity is 95%, so it'll correctly identify 950 people as not having had COVID-19. But 95% right means 5% wrong, so that test is going to generate 50 false positive results. So in fact, the prevalence of infection in that population was 0%, but that test told me it was 5%. That's a pretty big difference. Okay, let's work through a different example. But first of all, I mean, the critical point from a public health point of view is that using limited specificity tests to look for very rare conditions massively overestimates the presence of disease. Massively. So, I mean, in that example, from 0% to 5%, I mean, that's a huge difference. Okay, so that cannot be overstated. Massive. Okay, sorry, second example. So let's look at our 1,000 people, of whom 50 have had COVID-19, and let's use that same test. So first of all, it'll again overestimate the disease from 5% to 8%. These are the people who test positive. So it didn't do too badly in identifying the people who had had COVID. It got 47 out of 50 of them. But at the same time, it generated 34 false positives. So that's 81 tests, of which 34 were wrong. They were false positives. Now that's quite significant, because that means that in that scenario where about 5% of people have had COVID, and the test is about 95% accurate, if you get a positive test, there's actually a 42% chance that you haven't had COVID-19. And that is a huge problem if you're going to take that test result and then increase your degree of exposure to potential new infection, believing yourself to be protected. So you were sold this test as being 95% accurate, but actually the result it's given you, if you get a positive result, is not much better than flipping a coin. So what are the implications for individuals here? I mean, I'm a medical doctor. Every day I prescribe people drugs, and for the whole 20 years of my career, I've been telling people you can have generic drugs. You know, you don't need to go for the drugs that are made by the big name companies, the ones that you've seen advertised. It's fine to go for generic medications made by smaller companies. Drug content's the same, equally effective, significantly cheaper. Choose generic. What about testing? Well, I mean, if we look at these COVID-19 antibody tests, of the 12 companies that I showed you earlier on, some are very small companies we've never heard of, and some of them are larger companies that have got a long track record. I mean, just randomly picking a couple out, Roche and Abbott have now got a COVID-19 antibody test on the market. Now, I'm not going to specifically name or endorse a large company, but one large company is claiming 100% sensitivity and 99.8% specificity on its COVID-19 antibody test. And they've trialed it on 5,000 people, which is not too bad. It still hasn't gone through the formal regulatory approval process. We're still looking at a test that's only authorized for emergency use. But my takeaway on testing for COVID-19, whereas with medication, I would say choose generic drugs. For antibody tests, don't go with a generic test. Go with a test made by a company that you've heard of, and make sure the person who's offering you the test can confidently tell you the sensitivity and the specificity. Make sure the doctor knows exactly what the test is doing and has full confidence in the result they're going to give you. Otherwise, you could end up in a lot of trouble. Okay, so that's looking at individual implications. I mean, what about implications at the national level? As I've said before, if you use low sensitivity tests, low specificity tests to look for a rare condition, you massively overestimate the incidence of disease. So that can cause poor decision making at a national level, a public health level. Now, Japan has come in for a lot of criticism for being slow to expand PCR testing, but we're now seeing that inaccurate antibody testing is causing a lot of problems in other countries. So Japan's slightly more cautious approach to allow antibody testing to be carried out in this country perhaps does look a little bit more reasonable and sensible. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I hope that was all clear. Any comments, questions or feedback you have, there's a dedicated email address which you can write to. It is covidjapanwebinar@gmail.com. If you want more information about my practice, about my office, we have a website. It's www.tmsc.jp. And then finally, these are the further webinars that we'll be hosting later on this month. So we've got a webinar on Thursday the 14th of May about medications for COVID-19. The week after that, we're going to look at the possibility of an effective vaccine for COVID-19. And then the week after that, we have another talk about hospital access during the COVID-19 outbreak. So if you're interested in participating and joining any of those webinars, then please do email me on the above address. Otherwise, thank you very much for listening. Stay safe.